Once on your renew sequence, add 1 to your surplus for each 1 counter on this card. And then during your deployment, you may add a counter to this card to add 1 to your surplus instead of playing another resource. So a farm is a resource. The currency side is another type of resource, so you can choose one or the other. And then there's a number of resource cards in the decks themselves. So typically, unless one of those cards says you may also play a currency or a farm, you would only be able to choose one of those options each turn during your first deployment. You're adding a counter to the farm, and when you do that, it's going to generate 1 to your surplus. So the surplus is what you're using to spend for paying your card's cost. So it generates 1 surplus when you use it that turn, and then the second ability again, or excuse me, the first ability, it says on your renew sequence you can add 1 to your surplus for each counter on this card. So the very next turn, let's say you've used all this up, the very next turn at your renew sequence you gain another 1. And let's say for this example you choose during that turn to use the farm again. So you can add another counter, that generates another surplus. You spend that surplus that turn, and the following turn on your renew sequence you have 2 at this point. So during your renew sequence you get 2 more surplus. So building into your farms is going to generate, you know, a lot of surplus throughout the game. It's definitely a long-term play. You're making yourself sometimes a little bit more vulnerable to go farms early on in the game, but you're going to get a lot of resources out of them by the end. So sometimes worth it. And the last thing I wanted to mention on the farm is don't remove counters from this card. It says it right at the very bottom. The reason we have that on the card is to remind you that during your renew sequence, when you're pulling counters off of all of your cards, you don't want to remove counters from farms. It works almost the opposite of how counters work on every other card in the game. For every other card in the game, it's basically a countdown for when you can use your ability again. But on the farm, you're basically building up your farm's potency during the game. So during the renew sequence, you don't remove counters from this. And actually, there aren't any cards that can remove counters from a farm. Everything in the game is referring to either removing counters from tactics or units or ground. There's not a card in here that will remove counters or add counters to the farm. That's just not something that we have in the game. So that is the answer to that question, kind of a two-parter. Thanks again to Ken Richards for posing that question, and I will see you next time on Siege Warfare Academy. Thank you.
Join us next time as we answer a question from D. Clevenger of Texas, who has encountered a very interesting situation that involves the ground Gettysburg as well as the card Flanking Maneuver. Thanks again for watching, and as always, enjoy the game.